Our next panel is about border realities, challenges and solutions, and our panelists bring some truly fascinating perspectives. For many Americans who live and work in U.S. border communities, the political rhetoric that they hear around immigration is painting their communities in a light that they neither recognize nor appreciate. These are communities where neighbors live, work, learn, and pray with one another every day. Today, we're going to discuss the realities they face and how we can have a better conversation around those facts. For this panel, we have with us Julie Myers-Wood, former Assistant Secretary for Homeland Security for Immigration and Customs Enforcement and the current Chief Executive Officer of Guidepost Solutions. We have Doris Meissner, former Commissioner of the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service and current Senior Fellow and Director of the U.S. Immigration Policy Program at the Migration Policy Institute. Michael DeBrule, former Director of Casa de la Sagrado Corazon in El Paso and retired Chief Patrol Agent for the U.S. Border Patrol. And finally, our moderator for this panel is Fiona Harrigan of Reason Magazine. Let's have a round of applause for our panelists.
Thank you very much for being here. I think we'll start with Doris here. You've said that it's unrealistic to base control over the border on zero irregular migrant crossings, as the 2006 Secure Fence Act does. What is a more reasonable measure of an orderly, humane U.S.-Mexico border?
Well, thank you, Fiona, and good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here. It's quite a time to be talking about these issues in different ways, isn't it? I would say that when we're talking about border control and measuring border control, that there are different and varying measures, and they depend on particularly resources and the nature of the flows. So that the idea of just establishing, as was the case in the Secure Fence Act, zero tolerance, no border crossings, really is completely unrealistic from the standpoint of what law enforcement really is all about. Any law enforcement agency, any law enforcement function that exists on the proposition that there will always be some infractions of the law, and law enforcement exists in order to respond to that and to manage it. So in the case of the border and border control, as I say, with varying measures and changing circumstances, let me just tick off a couple of examples of what I think that really means in terms of recent experience. So what recent experience tells us, and for me recent goes a bit back, which is to say the period, yes, Julie and I are in somewhat of a different club than some of you. So let me talk about quickly the pre-9/11 period, because the pre-9/11 period was a period where we basically measured control in terms of apprehensions. And you could argue it either way. If apprehensions at the border were high, we said, oh, well, that's really getting to good control because so many people are being apprehended. But at the same time, if apprehensions were low, one could argue, oh, well, this is really approaching control because less and less people are crossing, and that suggests control. There really was no way truly to know, and there was no way truly to know, and there still isn't, because we've never been able to truly capture how many attempts at crossing exist. So until you know from your apprehensions what percentage that actually represents of the numbers crossing, you don't really have a fair measure. And at that time, because of the very high numbers, the it was a situation that was well known as the revolving door, which is to say that the large share of the flow was young Mexican males, 98%, who were coming to the United States to try to work, and they were looking to avoid apprehension. They did not want to see a Border Patrol agent. And so under those circumstances, when they returned back to Mexico, it was not difficult to try again and try multiple times, and then large shares actually succeeded. So that is not control, even though there were high numbers and low numbers. Well, then you go to the post-9/11 period. And in the post-9/11 period, there was a huge influx of resources into border enforcement. And I think that actually looking back, by about the mid-2010s, 2012, 2013, we got as close as we've been able to get to somewhat meaningful control. And that is because there were sufficient resources for the Border Patrol to install or use what was termed consequence enforcement, which is to say that although the flows were still almost entirely Mexican, there was a consequence for being apprehended and coming across the border, which then led to far, far lower numbers of recidivists. The recidivism rate had been in the high 30 percentiles, or early 40 percentiles. Under consequence enforcement, it fell to somewhere in the neighborhood of about 15%. And that comes pretty close to what you would want to see as a level of control. The numbers of apprehensions every year fell to less than 500,000 a year, which has never been heard of since. But what happened is, of course, what happens, and that is that the world changed. The flows changed. So the fact that the flows then changed from primarily young Mexican males to what we all know now, people from Central America, people from the rest of the hemisphere, people from all over the world, representing mixed flows. And these, of course, are an entirely different circumstance because these are people that are looking to find a Border Patrol agent. They are not trying to avoid apprehension. They want to be identified so that they can file a claim for asylum, very large numbers. And that's an entirely different circumstance. Control today turns on the resources that are needed to actually process people and to process those people either for expedited removal or for an asylum decision and a determination on an asylum claim. And the resources are inadequate to meet both of those needs. We don't have enough resources, even with lower numbers, for that kind of processing. And those people who are screened in for asylum come into the country and wait for many, many years for a decision. That is not meaningful control. And so we're at a situation where, with the question, what's orderly and what's humane? I would say that what's orderly and humane requires a high degree of flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances along the border. They might be circumstances that are hotspots and criminality that need to be confronted as quickly as possible, or they may be shifts and flows that require the kind of cross-agency coordination and the kinds of resources, such as asylum officers and immigration judges, that can deliver timely decisions and deliver on humanitarian protection grounds.
We'll continue with Julie. Setting aside for a moment the humanitarian concerns of such a policy, of which there are many, does ICE have the operational and logistical capacity to remove all migrants and asylum seekers coming to the US-Mexico border today? What happens when a nation simply refuses to accept deportees, such as with Venezuela?
Those are great questions, and thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here today to talk about these important issues, where unfortunately many of the concerns have not changed over years. The challenges for the border have not changed over the years, they've only kind of grown. But as Doris noted, ICE does not have all the resources it would need to carry out such a mission. It's never been funded for that sort of operation. If you think about ICE's current budget, it's about, excuse me, it's about $7 billion. It sounds like a lot of money, right? The Department of Corrections in California is $14 million. The New York Police Department for New York City is about $11 billion all in. And so even though $7 billion is a lot of money, huge amount of money, it's not the amount of money that would allow ICE to effectively work on deportation at such a large level. And in terms of the number of agents that are currently tasked with focusing on enforcement and removal, for ICE, it's about 7,000, right? And so ICE has overall about 21,000 employees, but 7,000 of those are tasked with the enforcement and removal operation. So it's a much smaller operation there. And that's why I think they do, in this administration, have to focus on priorities. And we've already started to see some of the language shifting towards focusing on the priorities that most people care about, and that's getting out helping the transnational criminals be removed and others that are causing harm to our country versus those that are in the country and not causing harm. But it's a huge challenge, the resource challenge, and so I think ICE now will be dealing with how do we really prioritize effectively? Every administration says they're going to do that. How do they do that and meet their mandate of increasing the numbers, right? So that's a really big challenge. And it's hard when countries don't want to take individuals back, especially when the shift of individuals who are unauthorized is not primarily Mexico anymore, or just a little more than 50% Mexican now. It's from all over the world. There are about 13 countries that the U.S. has said are difficult to have nationals of those countries return home. And so what happens in that instance is, let's say there is an individual who's in this country without authorization from China, right? And they are arrested, and then you need to kind of get an agreement to take them home. They may not have a passport. China may not say that they're Chinese. You got to get them home. So there are a lot of difficulties with that, even if you've worked through the formal process, right? The formal asylum process or the formal removal process. So there are a lot of challenges there. And you might say, well, why can't the U.S. do something about these 13 countries that are not going to take people back? And I'm sure Doris worked on that when she was in government. I did as well. And there is a section of the INA that provides Section 243D, which provides for sanctions for countries that refuse to take their nationals back. But the problem is, at least historically, removal of non-citizens to home countries was not a top priority. So the Department of State or others did not really want to focus sanctions on this issue versus other issues. Now that may change in this administration, but I think historically that's been a big problem.
Over to Michael now. During this election season, we saw a lot of negative rhetoric about migrants and the border, that they are dangerous criminals and so on. Does that rhetoric reflect the reality you see on the ground?
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. First of all, I wouldn't blame anyone for thinking that there's a migrant crime wave coming into our country. It's what we hear all the time, that rhetoric, that narrative. So as a matter of fact, I speak to a lot of immersion groups that go to El Paso. I live right on the border. And you can see clearly that that's what people think, because that's what they hear all the time. There is a great study called the Marshall Project, which measured the correlation between the population of migrants in metropolitan areas, the increase in population of migrants in metropolitan areas, and the correlation between that and crime in that area. And it's measured between 2008 and 2016, that correlation. So there were a lot of charts that came out of that, a lot of information. The national chart indicated that our increase in migration in population in the United States was 18%, and crime was reduced by about 36%. And the cool thing about that study was that you could really kind of put in any metropolitan area, and if they studied that area, it came up. And time after time after time, every city that I put in, it related the same kind of thing. A good example is Atlanta, Georgia, where their migrant population increased almost 600% within that time, and their crime went down by about 50%. So, and it seems like all the studies that I've read are about the same, having to do with that. I'm not sure exactly what that means. You need to know all the nuances of the study to know exactly what that means, but maybe we need more migrants in the country. I'm not sure, to decrease our crime. But also, I mean, just from my own reality is that in my about 10 or 12 years in the field as a Border Patrol agent, working for Ms. Meisner, by the way, decades ago, my own reality was that I interviewed hundreds of people that had crossed the border. And with little exception, all these people were either fleeing from something or walking towards hope of a better future for themselves and their family. So those two things, all the studies that I've read, my own reality of actually talking to people from the time that they left their door to the moment that they stood before me, talking about that journey and all the details of that journey, that does not reflect what we're hearing in the media and the narrative that we hear about criminals crossing the border in great droves.
Doris, returning to a point that you made, crossing demographics at the U.S.-Mexico border have shifted dramatically over the last decade, from Mexican single adults to Central American families and unaccompanied children, and now to a much broader set of nationalities. Has the Department of Homeland Security implemented infrastructural or practical changes to adapt to those shifts? And what changes would you like to see?
Well, I think it's fair to say that the current administration has worked very, very hard to try to respond in a way that balances enforcement and control with protection. Nobody's really found that balance yet, but that has been the driving motivation in this administration. And so we have seen some important innovations. We've seen this idea that is now ricocheting around the world of safe mobility offices. Now some people are calling it externalizing admissions, et cetera, but the idea of the safe mobility offices really is a very innovative idea, and it brings with it a lot of promise. There have been all kinds of barriers and difficulties, but it's an innovation. CBP One, as in the CBP One app, there are definitely things that could be improved and should, I think, be done differently with the CBP One app, but it is, again, an effort at trying to find a balance and bringing some innovation through the executive branch into managing these flows. The special programs, obviously the CHNV, vast expansions of TPS, and probably most importantly, the extraordinary use of parole, which is very controversial and very pushing the envelope legally in ways that I don't think anybody would have imagined. But nonetheless, those have been real efforts to deal with an absolutely unprecedented situation. So, you know, in terms of changes, there's all kinds of critique that one can make of what the current administration has done in terms of the sequencing, the timing, et cetera, but the issue here really is beyond the executive branch. This is an issue of the Congress, and we know that that's a very easy thing to say, but it is absolutely the case that the changes that are needed ultimately do reside with the Congress, and the Congress is the part of government that's been completely missing in action for decades now, where immigration is concerned. If there were to be attention by Congress, resources are number one answers. There obviously would be a desire to make substantive changes. But I think in terms of border and border enforcement, where we really need to invest is at the ports of entry and at the ability to process through the ports of entry, as well as the infrastructure across the entire border of processing in ways that are suitable for the kinds of flows we're seeing today as compared with those of decades ago.
Could I just add one thing on this innovation piece? Because I think it's really important for the new administration to look at all that has been done and where there are things that could make immigration enforcement more effective, streamline the process, all of those things. In one area where I think there has been some innovation that I hope the new administration will focus on and look at has been in the area of E-Verify and expanding E-Verify. And I think that's an area, in my view, where Congress could really step in and expand the use of E-Verify. Most people that are coming to this country without authorization are coming for a job, right? They're coming for hope. They're coming for those things. And so if there are tools like E-Verify which reduce the illegal workforce, I think that can be very effective. And I think there has been a lot of progress on E-Verify in this past administration. That is one of the innovations. I also think looking at the CBP1 app, even though they may not like the way it was used and other things, that tool, those kinds of tools can be very effective. And we can't just go back to kind of yesteryear in terms of enforcement and think it's going to be effective. So I would hope that they would look at those kinds of things for innovation.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point, and I agree.
Staying with you, Julie, in your experience, when you were with DHS, who tended to be smugglers bringing migrants to the U.S., and who are the smugglers today?
Well, I think before I came to DHS, smuggling was more of a family business. There would be kind of individuals. The smugglers would be paid to get the aliens, the unauthorized migrants moved across the border and to their final destinations through airports, bus terminals, and interstates. But then the laws started changing, and we started to see the drug cartels get more and more involved into organized smuggling operations. Because why? Because the money is there, right? And so when I was at DHS, and now, the drug cartels are very involved, very sophisticated smuggling organizations. I think one of the things that didn't occur as much when I was in the government and we are seeing now, unfortunately, are all these unaccompanied minors that are coming in. And they're actually flooding child labor throughout meatpacking plants and other kinds of low-wage industries throughout the country, and that's a huge problem. And when I was at ICE, we didn't see as much of the unaccompanied minor, and now the incentives are there for those smugglers to get those kids in, and unfortunately, those kids are often face a lot of harm once they're here.
Michael, back to you. In October, you shut down your shelter, Sacred Heart, because there weren't enough migrants and asylum seekers arriving in El Paso who needed sheltering. Are other shelters along the border similarly downsizing or closing? How does that jibe or clash with national views of the U.S.-Mexico border right now?
Yes, when I came around the corner there at Sacred Heart Shelter in December of 2022, there were 1,000 migrants surrounding the church and shelter. And so that caused the pastor there to fling open the doors of an old gym that he had there. But in September of this year, he came to me and said, we're going to go ahead and close down the shelter because I feel like we have achieved our mission here to serve people in need, and there's just not a need anymore. Since December of 2023, encounters along the southwest border by the Border Patrol has decreased by almost 80%. And since February of this year, as a matter of fact, it's decreased 40%. So speaking of those immersion groups that I talk to all the time, they show up recently and they were kind of looking around and trying to figure out where everybody is. But actually, there's very few migrants coming across the border, comparatively speaking, to a year ago and even since December. So we have seen a lot of shelters closed down. There's significant capacity, certainly in El Paso, and my understanding is that that is reflected all across the 2,000-mile border between the United States and Mexico.
Doris, back to you. What has been Mexico's role in managing migration to the U.S.-Mexico border in recent months? Is it sustainable, and is it humane?
Well, the story of the U.S. and Mexico now is one of the undertold stories of what is taking place. As my former colleague knows, both former colleagues actually, there's always been cooperation between Mexico and the United States. And at the working level, the Border Patrol and communities along the border have always had very close and ongoing working relationships, with Mexican authorities. But this current effort now is well beyond what's taken place at the local level, well beyond what the relationships have been between fellow law enforcement agencies. It really is between the countries at the national level, very high levels within the US government and the Mexican government. And it's been essential because it does really recognize and demonstrate that these issues, certainly today, they always have been, but far more so today, are binational, cross-national, regional, and all countries involved need to own these issues in terms of what their interests are and how they are and are not affected by today's migrant flows and the criminality that underlies it and propels it. So when I say that it's a somewhat undertold story, I think it is absolutely fair to say that the really sharp reduction in the numbers coming across the border that have taken place primarily since June, but began really earlier in January of this year, certainly are due to the June new order that the Biden administration put into place, but more deeply they are due to what Mexico has been doing in impeding flows as well as in accepting people back from the United States in order to prevent recurring flows. A lot of it is not pretty. A lot of it is incredibly random and arbitrary, but at the same time, it does represent, along the lines of what we've been saying here, the seeds of a newer way, a different level of consciousness, a different level of understanding of national interests, certainly in Mexico and in some other countries in the hemisphere. Now, of course, other countries in the hemisphere, including Mexico, don't have nearly the kinds of resources that the United States has to apply to this. And as we've been saying, the United States doesn't have enough resources to really deal in a way that is both control and humane enforcement in ways that we would like to see. But I do think that we have, in what's taking place now with Mexico, the elements of a regional strategy and of the kind of collaboration and the kind of shared purposes that will be needed over the longer term. It's highly fragile. It's highly fragile both in terms of the resources being devoted and the political will, possibly more so. And I think that it is one of the things that is most at risk now in the change in administrations, because the way in which the two countries have worked together quietly and systematically is very different stylistically from what we are likely to see in a new administration. And I think that is something that's really going to be put to the test, and I'm concerned about it.
Julie, what are the most significant changes that you've seen at the US-Mexico border since your time with the Department of Homeland Security, and what has remained the same?
I think what Doris mentions about the cooperation with Mexico and the increased cooperation with Mexico, finding a shared purpose in these efforts, I think is something that is changing and was growing. We all have been at millions of bilats with Mexico, right? And often immigration was seen as kind of the US issue only, right? And seeing it now as a shared purpose and as a shared problem, given all the migrants that are obviously coming through Mexico as well, I think has some potential to reduce unauthorized flows, but that it is very fragile. And so my hope would be that the new ambassador, that the new team, they really work at this to see that we can do more together and we can be more successful together in stopping unauthorized flows. What hasn't changed is the people trying to come here for work, I think the most, that are just kind of flowing through. I remember when I was at ICE, I was meeting folks in a jail that had been arrested for criminal activity as well as other things. And I met an individual actually from my home, who was in my hometown in Kansas City. And he said he'd been deported 3 times, and each time he came back to Kansas City. And this time he had another skirmish with the law, so he was in the local jail. And I asked him, Kansas City's a great town, but why did you come back to Kansas City? He said, there's a roofing company, gives me a job here. Every time I'll come back here to get a job with this roofing company. And I think we are not dealing properly with the demand for labor in the United States, and that's something that has not changed, that we do not have the right path for people to come here legally and so that we can fill all the jobs, and that's something that needs to be definitely changed. I mean, the number of employees in the immigration component has quadrupled or tripled since 2000, right? But we're not doing any better at the problem. So just giving more money to ICE and those agencies is not going to solve the problem if we don't hit on the demand and looking at, do we have the right kind of legal flow?
Michael, when you started working at your former shelter, many migrants and asylum seekers were sleeping on the streets of El Paso, and that image created a real sense of chaos at the US-Mexico border. How did your shelter step in to help, and what did that moment teach you about achieving both welcome and order in times of increased migration?
Well, first of all, let me say that this is not the first time that we've had large numbers of people coming across the southwest border. When you look at migration across the southwest border, you really have to take the long view. And back to the 80s, up until about 2000 or so, we had very little what we're calling, manpower, infrastructure, and technology. There were a lot of people coming across the border at different times, as many as were coming now. As a matter of fact, there's a new tool that DHS has put together that measures what they call gotaways, and the Border Patrol people who were not encountered by the Border Patrol and actually came into the country, along with encounters. And they've estimated that in the year 2000, well, in 2023, it's estimated that 3.1 million people came across the border, that is, they gotaways and encounters. In 2000, it was estimated that there were actually 3.9 million people that came across the border that year. In 2004, 3.2. And in 2005, 3.3. So this is not the first time that there have been a large number of people coming across the border. The difference today, I think, is that when people made application for entry in the last few years, they were given, because we don't have the infrastructure to hold everyone, they were let into the United States, and then they, shortly after that, had to appear in an immigration court for a deportation hearing. But what that caused was that we saw these people, whereas in the 80s and 90s, these people avoided encounter, and they were not seen or heard from. Certainly, they were working in hotels that we were staying at and working in restaurants that we went to, etc. But they were largely an unseen population. Whereas recently, people were turned themselves in, as Ms. Meissner indicated, they turned themselves into the Border Patrol, and they were let into the country for a time. And so we were forced to kind of deal with that situation. So that's the big difference. But and those times when there were a lot of people coming across the border, in 2000 it was almost 1 million entries, we heard the following about that. That's right, nothing. We heard nothing about it. Nobody talked about it. It was not publicized significantly, etc. So the difference now is that we see people. But let me talk about the recent influx around the church there. First of all, what I was surprised by was that I kind of didn't know what to expect because of the narrative, etc. But America is really a welcoming country, and that's really what I found was that people came from all over the country to the shelter. They drove there, they flew there, etc. They offered their help. They brought food, they brought clothes, and they kept coming. So that was rather a pleasant surprise for me because of all the narrative that we're hearing all the time, that America is really a welcoming nation. So what you hear, don't believe it. It's really not true. I think that, again, America proved to me that, we're really just a great nation of caring people. And as far as order, I think as Julie mentioned, and Ms. Spicer, the CBP-1 app, there have been advances to creating orderly entries. A great thing about the CBP-1 app, the theory that you apply from wherever you are, your home, for example, and you avoid that long, difficult trek through all those countries, the Darien Gap, etc., and the encounters with the cartel. All these people that I talked to in the shelter have been robbed at least twice, sometimes beaten, kidnapped, or worse. So this tool theoretically would, with applying to the CBP-1 app, you avoid all those things. So a few things that I learned during this latest influx and working at the shelter there.
Thank you all. We'll turn to some audience questions now, and any of you should feel free to jump in if you'd like to respond. Our first, deterrence is not a long-term solution. How can the administration shift its focus from only deterrence methods to effective pathways for migration?
Well, this issue of deterrence and deterrence not being, you can't just use deterrence methods. I think it's really important to always be realistic that deterrence has to be part of any kind of a meaningful enforcement model and idea. And sometimes that's been very hard for people to accept. Deterrence cannot be the only thing, but it is legitimately part of any kind of law enforcement, and particularly this kind of law enforcement. So I really, I think that we've all got to be realistic, particularly in light of what happened in this election and what the perception is in public opinion and in the country today about chaos and lack of control. Some of that answer to that resides in effective deterrence. Now, that said, you cannot get effective deterrence with just what the executive branch can bring to bear. As I said before, this requires broader solutions, and to Julie's point, in particular, it requires an immigration system that acknowledges the importance of immigration to our future, our labor markets, our demographics. We no longer, as a matter of our aging society, the fertility levels, we do not have enough native-born younger workers coming into our workforce to maintain our productivity and our growth as a world power. We depend on immigration. We are not set up statutorily to confront that future. And so deterrence has to be part of answers, but the broader answers cannot be generated by the executive branch acting on its own.
And I just want to add, I completely agree with Doris, and I think the legislative branch has to act. And what we've seen is in the Bush administration, they thought they couldn't do a lot of things by executive order, right? There are things they wanted to do, couldn't get a comprehensive immigration bill passed, and thought they couldn't do things on their own. And when President Obama came in, he started using executive orders more broadly, and that's continued on. But you know what? It's piecemeal. It doesn't work. It can't kind of solve all the problems. And then you lop these executive orders on top of a broken statutory system. That's not the kind of system that we want to have as a whole. So I just hope that Congress will look hard at this and think about these challenges that Doris raises, because otherwise we're going to be sitting here, we could have the same panel 4 years from now, right, about the challenges that we face.
Yeah, well, we all know that immigration, applying immigration on the border is a complex thing, and it takes a mix between policy and enforcement efforts. You can never have just all enforcement, close the border. That's not going to happen. And you can't do it all by policy either. So it's a multi-pronged issue, and it requires a multi-pronged reaction.
That'll do it for us. Thank you so much for your insights. This has been a great conversation. I've been asked to tell you all that we're going to take a quick break after this panel to set up for the next. But for now, give our panelists a hand.